Delighted to have our third speaker today, Dave Chalmers, who's going to talk to us about perception, illusion, and hallucination in virtual and augmented reality. Dave.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Derek, and thanks to all of you for putting together this this great working group and series of workshops. Yeah, I'm going to be talking today about both virtual and augmented reality. You know, I'd like to focus more on augmented reality, but then there is a lot of virtual reality in the background. So I'll probably spend at least the first half going through some of the issues about virtual reality. I did present to at least a group at Glasgow. I don't know if it counted at the same group, but there was some workshops about 5 years ago where I talked about the issues in virtual reality. So some of this will be familiar to people who were there. And that was a paper I wrote maybe 5-6 years ago called The Virtual and the Real. A lot of this stuff also, a lot of this material is also in this book that Cotty and Scott were just mentioning on Reality Plus Virtual Worlds and the Problems of Philosophy. The book is mostly on issues tied to VR, but 2 of the chapters are on AR, its role in extending the mind and extending the world. And in the second half, I'll get to some of the issues about illusion and hallucination there. So the main thesis in this book is, and my work on virtual reality in general, is that virtual reality is a kind of genuine reality. It's not a second-class reality, a fake or a fictional reality. It's not an illusion or a hallucination. You know, there's a very strong tendency to regard virtual reality as that kind of second-class reality, but that's a take I'm strongly opposed to. That thesis breaks down into a few different components in the book. First is the idea that, you know, physical reality itself could turn out to be a virtual reality. I won't talk about that today. Third is the idea that we can lead a meaningful life in virtual reality. I also won't be talking about that today. I'm going to be very much focusing here on the second core thesis, which is that virtual reality is not an illusion or a hallucination. An issue itself, which is very strongly tied to perception and its relation to VR, and more generally the mind and its relationship to VR and to AR. So a very common view is that virtual objects are unreal, that perception in virtual reality is a hallucination or at least an illusion. And here the idea is pretty much always, whenever you perceive a virtual object, that virtual object doesn't exist. Maybe it's a fictional object. So this is not really a case of perceiving an object that exists. It's a hallucination, or on a related view, it's an illusion. You find this even in people writing very sympathetically to VR. William Gibson, who introduced the word, I think when he introduced the term cyberspace, he meant something like the space of virtual reality as we understand it now. Cyberspace has come to be understood more broadly as something much more like the internet, whether it's VR or not. But I think what he originally meant was something like VR. And he said it's a consensual hallucination experienced daily by billions of people. They're the idea that it's not really fully real. My view is that perception in VR and also in AR need not be a hallucination or an illusion. It certainly can be. You can get hallucinations and illusions in VR and AR, and I think Derek very nicely brought out some of the ways that one can. I'm not going to say they're less susceptible to hallucinations or illusions than physical reality. Of course, you can get them, but the thought is that the extreme view, though, is that perception of virtual objects, whether in VR or AR, is always a hallucination, or at least an illusion, and that's the view I want to resist. It need not be a hallucination or an illusion, and often, especially for sophisticated, experienced users of VR and AR, it can involve accurate perception of virtual objects. In the case of VR, accurate perception of virtual objects in a virtual world, and in the case of AR, accurate perception of virtual and physical objects in at least a largely physical world, or perhaps a mixed physical and virtual world. So first, I'll just get on to a table, a standard philosophical distinction between hallucination and illusion, which the others have touched on already. as all understand it, in the case of hallucination, the object you perceive doesn't exist, whereas in the case of illusion, the object you perceive exists, but is not the way it appears to be. So classic case of an illusion, pink elephant, it's just somehow conjured up by the mind. Let's take it, no fancy augmented reality technology here. They've been on a bender. Okay, so yeah, the elephant, on a standard view here, there's nothing that not that they're seeing something and misperceiving it as an elephant. The elephant is conjured up out of whole cloth. There's no object they're really seeing. That's a hallucination. On the other hand, the case of the the bent stick or the broken stick in water, here there really is something that you're seeing intuitively, the pencil, but you're misperceiving it as being bent or broken. So that's an illusion. So the first view of this virtual objects is that, that I want to combat, is that virtual objects just don't exist. Very common view. Neil MacDonald, for example, has written classic works arguing for with virtual fictionalism, along with Nathan Wildman. They've given eloquent defenses of the idea that virtual reality is best understood as a fiction and that virtual objects don't exist. Perception of virtual objects on this view, well, since they don't exist, when you appear to be perceiving them, I take it the view is you're not really perceiving anything at all. Perception of virtual objects is a kind of hallucination. I don't know. Have you written anything on this in the perception context? Neil, Nathan? Okay, but anyway, that's what I infer from their virtual fictionalism. Since virtual objects don't exist, it's naturally taken to be a kind of hallucination here. There's nothing you're really perceiving. My view is that virtual objects are digital objects that certainly exist. The perception of virtual objects is not a hallucination. And we talked about this a bit just in the last session. My view in particular is that virtual objects should be best regarded as data structures, typically instances of data structures actually instantiated and running on a given computer at a given time. And I think, data structures, this kind of instantiated data structures, play just an incredibly crucial causal role throughout the use of data software for all kinds of purposes. Here's a little illustration of the rough idea. We have a biological cat, a robot cat, and a virtual cat. I want to say they're all different kinds of things, but they're all nonetheless causally efficacious. The virtual cat is ultimately, that you perceive, is ultimately a data structure sitting on a computer, but it can still play causal roles. That's still, when you perceive the virtual cat, you're perceiving something just as much as when you perceive a robot cat. It's just in the case of the virtual cat, it's a largely computational entity, a data structure sitting on a computer. Every virtual object corresponds to a data structure, or sometimes to more than one data structure, depending on how things are set up. When I see a virtual object, it's this data structure that's causing my experience. When I see the virtual cat, the cat data structure is linked to my experience. You change the cat data structure so that the cat is now in a different location or in a different resting position, then my experience will correspondingly change. Furthermore, when two virtual objects interact, when the virtual cat meets a virtual dog or something, then the two data structures interact and change correspondingly. I think it's very much analogous to what goes on in the physical world when two physical objects interact. I mean, of course, there's many differences about how it's set up, but I mean, I think it's very plausible these data structures are playing key causal roles in perception and in interaction. So if you're attracted by a causal view of perception, where what we perceive is something that causes our experience, then I think it's very natural to identify these virtual objects that we perceive in VR with data structures. So this is roughly the view that I call virtual realism, and in particular virtual digitalism, that in VR we perceive digital objects, and that perception of virtual objects is not a hallucination. Of course, this is not, I've not given any kind of knockdown argument, certainly here in 3 minutes. And in general, there's lots of resources for for opponents to resist. Someone could say it's actually a different object you're perceiving. Every now and then I hear the view that it's maybe really what you're perceiving in VR is like the screen on your headset. In AR, I guess it would be maybe the lens. I don't know. I find this somewhat implausible, not least because in multi-user VRs, we want to say that a whole lot of people perceive the same virtual object. They certainly don't perceive the same screen, but they can, I think, perceive a common digital object. Not to mention augmented realities. We were talking about the Mojo contact lenses before, whereas I think it's very implausible you actually perceive the lens in that case. So at least as a general theory, this is probably not going to work. But anyway, so I'm very much attracted by the idea that in VR, we perceive digital objects which have digital properties or virtual objects located in virtual spaces, and we have experiences. Our experiences of them are very much brought about by, what it is to be a virtual object in a virtual space is to be a digital object such as a data structure with certain digital properties. Then the question arises, okay, so that's to say that at least in VR, my view is not that perception, I'm opposed to the idea that perception in VR is a hallucination, although there is an important view on the other side. The next opposing view is that perceptual experience in VR is illusory. So here the question is, when experiencing VR, are things the way they look to be? And even if you're convinced by the case that virtual objects are digital objects, you might nevertheless think that, so VR perception is not a hallucination. You might nevertheless think it's an illusion. Why? Because we perceive virtual objects as being located in physical space. When I enter VR, you might think I experience objects as being present in front of me, and no such objects are present in front of me. So that's an illusion. Oh, here's an illustration from the book of the philosophers. We got the philosopher Suzanne Langer playing Beat Saber in VR. I guess she's using an Oculus Quest or something there. Susan Langer is great for this because she talks about the dance illusion in one of her classic books. I mean, Suzanne Langer was a pioneer of the virtual. She talked about all of the arts is essentially involving the virtual, whether it's music or visual arts and so on. They all came along with distinct illusions, and for dance, it was what she called the illusion of action. Anyway, so I thought maybe Suzanne Langer, if she thought about VR, might be inclined to think that, playing Beat Saber involves some kind of illusion where it seems to you that all these cubes are coming towards you and you're slicing through them, but actually, in the physical world, there are no cubes. They're either hallucinated or, even if they're digital objects, they're certainly not out there in front of her. So natural view of illusion in VR. So in this view, we perceive digital objects, but we misperceive them as located in physical space where they're not. That's an illusion. Okay, so that's another natural view. Mel Slater, pioneering psychologist of VR, has gone to town on this, cataloging a number of the illusions of VR. The place illusion, the illusion you're in a certain place when you're not, the plausibility illusion, the illusion that what's happening around you is really happening when it's not. There's also the embodiment illusion, the illusion that you have a certain body. My own view is that none of these actually are illusions, or at least none of these need to be illusions. They can be illusions of this kind, but they don't need to be. And for a sophisticated user, they won't be. And here in some of the earlier work I did, I made an analogy with the case of perception in a mirror. So question, when you look in a mirror, do you have the illusion that somebody is present on the other side of the glass through the wall? The illusion view says, perceptually appears that there is an object out there through the glass where there's not. The no illusion view of mirrors says, no, actually it perceptually appears there are objects on this side of the glass where they are, and that needn't be an illusion. I mean, I think you can get both cases. In some cases, mirror experiences clearly seem illusory, like when you don't know that a mirror is present, is the most obvious case. Maybe you walk into a restaurant that's got a big mirror. You don't know it's a mirror. At least initially, the restaurant seems much bigger. Then you realize, oh, that's a mirror. And now maybe somehow things reorient, but at least at the first moment, you can certainly get an illusion. On the other hand, there are cases where I think it's much less plausible you get this illusion. And here, the case I like best is driving a car and looking in the rearview mirror. Do the cars visible in the mirror perceptually appear to be in front of you or behind you? Okay, so here's a case. Yeah, I mean, you're driving the car. Do those cars seem to be out there in front of you through the mirror, or do they seem to be behind you? I submit that to anyone who's actually driven a car and looked in a mirror, those cars do not seem to be out there in front of you. They seem to be behind you. They perceptually seem to be behind you. I mean, here the conceit is, well, if you really had those labels on mirrors that say objects in mirror closer than they appear, because you really do get an illusion in that case. Well, if we got an illusion that objects were in front of us, we'd need this warning label on mirrors. Objects in mirrors are actually behind you. We don't need that warning label. Why? Because the objects actually look to be behind you. So I say phenomenologically, the cars visible in the mirror seem to be behind you. And I think this is an instance of what Cotty was calling the phenomenological shift. Maybe initially you don't know it's a mirror. You see things as being through the mirror, but once you know you're looking in a mirror, once you're cognizant of the whole situation, yeah, you can undergo a phenomenological shift with the mirror. Things seem to be on this side of you with the mirror. And certainly we've all long undergone that phenomenological shift for cars in a mirror. I mean, of course, this is going to be contested by some people. Some people are inclined to think that perception is very much low level and not the kind of thing that can be changed in this way by cognition. So there's an alternative view, which is in mirrors, objects continue to look as if they're through the mirror, but we now know that they're not through the mirror. So we judge post-perceptually that, say, the cars are behind us, even though they look to be ahead of us. So that's a deep and difficult issue tied to many deep and difficult issues about just what the contents of perception are. But my own view is this gets the perceptual phenomenology of looking in a mirror wrong. The cars really seem to be behind you. And what are the key features that make this a plausible case of illusion? They include that we know it's a mirror. We're used to using the mirror. We're familiar with it. Our action is set up to depend on, we brake or speed up depending on how we take things to be in the mirror behind us. We immediately perceive distinctive affordances of things in a mirror. I think all this actually carries over to the VR case. Maybe I'll move quickly to that. So the question now is experience of VR an illusion? Are things as they seem to be? And okay, I think the VR case is very much analogous to the mirror case. You can certainly get illusions in VR. If you enter VR without knowing it's VR, just as if you see a mirror without knowing it's a mirror, you may then misperceive virtual objects as being in front of you in physical space when the objects aren't there. Maybe someone uses VR for the first time. Maybe they don't know they're in VR. Here's an image. Here's an illustration of René Descartes in VR. And here, I guess the thought is he doesn't know he's in VR. This has been super duper VR, so doesn't feel the headset on his head and so on. He takes himself to be in this circumstance, sitting there in front of the fire with his paper in his hand and his dog, Monsieur Grappe, at his feet, Mr. Scratch. Then, okay, in this case, he may at least be undergoing an illusion. He takes himself to be in a physical space and all this to be going on around him physically, where it's not. So that's potentially an illusion. I'm assuming he's entered this VR temporarily. The case where it's been a lifelong VR is different, but I won't go into that one. On the other hand, what about after much time in VR, when one knows one's in VR, which is much more the actual case? When I put on my Quest headset, I'm not under any illusion that I'm not in VR. Well, I think after some time in VR, you adapt to VR, just as you adapt to a mirror. You treat it as a separate virtual space that involves virtual objects. So, and I want to say that, I've already made the case that virtual tables aren't the same as non-virtual tables, but they're real objects, and virtual space is not the same as non-virtual space, but it's genuinely a sort of space. I want to say you actually perceive virtual tables in virtual space, and that's accurate. So the non-illusion view of VR is that, at least for a sophisticated user, you perceive objects as virtual objects located in virtual space, and that's in fact where they are. They really are virtual objects located in virtual space. At least if you take my view, where virtual objects are digital objects and virtual space is a real digitally constituted kind of space, then I think in this case, you can actually have accurate perception of virtual reality. Just as you undergo this phenomenological shift upon looking in a mirror, perceiving things as being behind you, I think you can undergo a kind of a phenomenological shift with VR, perceiving objects as virtual objects in virtual space. I think, as with the case of a mirror, this very often goes along with distinct affordances in VR, distinct means of interaction with virtual objects, at least in existing virtual objects. You don't really touch objects. Maybe you've got some fancy haptics, but for the most part, you reach out for an object in VR, and very frequently, your hand will go through the object. Maybe there are special ways to pick them up, but again, the special forms of action are required. Maybe avatars move through each other in VR. There's all kinds of special ways to interact with virtual objects. Become, I think, quite important in perceiving them as virtual. I guess here's a Grand Theft Auto situation where some people are just using a controller, and you got these special affordances on a controller associated with perceiving VR. I think experienced users are cognitively oriented to VR with its distinct affordances. And this, I think, the distinct affordances structure a distinctive kind of perception. At least what I would say then is, in VR, you have accurate representation of virtual space that needn't be an illusion. Again, the illusion view was you perceive these virtual objects as being in physical space where they aren't. I want to say you perceive them as being in virtual space where they are. This kind of goes along with the idea that when you know you're in VR, at least for a sophisticated user, you have this kind of sense of virtuality. You've got this sense that the objects are virtual. Whereas when you're in physical reality, especially, contrasting with VR, you've got this sense of physicality. You're in the physical world. You've got a sense that things are physical. And I think this sense of virtuality and this sense of physicality is really quite important to thinking about perception in virtual and physical reality. So I want to say that Mel Slater's illusions here needn't actually be illusions. Instead of talking about the place illusion, we should talk about the sense of place in VR, the sense of plausibility, the sense of embodiment, and they can, in many cases, actually be accurate. Okay, so that's VR out of the way. In the remaining time, I want to talk about augmented reality. Augmented reality is so cool in many ways for philosophers, and we've already begun to experience some of these aspects in these first two workshops. I mean, I'm interested in it especially because first, here's a cool instance of AR from Magic Leap. I guess Ronnie can tell us whether this was really something that one can perceive in VR. It's a very cool elephant, or whether this is more of a mock-up. But yeah, you're seeing physically your hands, your physical hands, and there's a virtually constituted elephant that somehow seems to be in that space too. And we can raise all these questions. Is that elephant an illusion, hallucination, or what? Augmented reality can extend the mind or extend the world, or both. And that's part of why it's so interesting. In Reality Plus, I have one chapter on the way in which it can extend the mind. Here, that's Andy Clark. I hope it took a while to get the resemblance right, but hopefully we got close in the end. There's Andy Clark hanging out in an augmented reality future where his environment is augmented with so much information. It identifies people. It gives him routes to where to go. It's got his favorite dish at a favorite restaurant. It's got his planning. It's got his bodily perception, all of which one can argue enriches his mental processes. And Andy and I wrote a paper about this back in the 90s about ways in which technology extends perception, memory, recognition, planning, and so on. It's like AR has the potential to do all of that kind of. I mean, smartphones already do it a lot, but AR is going to do that on steroids by having all this information so directly present to us. It may eventually make us master different languages by automatically translating languages for us. It may give us automatic recognition so it may improve our recognitional capacities, but this is its role in extending the mind. Today, I'm more focused on its role in extending the world. So this is Washington Square Park, just 1 block from here. And this is a Washington Square Park of the future where everyone is using, I guess, a common augmented reality system. And yeah, someone is playing a virtual piano in Washington Square, and there's a virtual dog and a virtual phone and some various other virtual things extending the environment. That we want to say, what is the status of the virtual piano? Is it a hallucination? Is it an illusion? Or is it just veridical perception? And you know, some of the issues here are the same as the issues for VR, but some of them are different. Again, the hallucination view, if you held that in the case of VR, you can also hold that in the case of AR. The virtual elephant and the virtual piano don't exist. There's no object one perceives in AR. It's just a fictional object. My view is, I think, you know, the virtual elephant and the virtual piano are real digital objects that one perceives, and the case for it is at least fairly similar to the case from before. What's really playing the key causal role in bringing about your perceptions are certain data structures sitting on a server somewhere, probably in many of these cases for multi-user AR. In some cases, sitting in your glasses. But yeah, they're real digital objects that you perceive. But now we have the illusion view. And I think the illusion view has got, maybe it's got more going for it in the AR case than in the VR case. I mean, it's got a good bit going for it in both cases. But the illusion view of AR says you perceive real virtual objects, but you misperceive them as located in physical space. And I think that's a very natural view to hold of the AR case. In the VR, and it's harder to reply to than in the case of VR. In the VR case, the natural move was to say, okay, well, you actually perceive those virtual objects as being located in a virtual space, not in physical space, because you know you're in VR, so the virtual space is different from physical space. You know and understand all that. But that's less plausible in the case of AR, because in AR, you see all these things as being located in a common space as the physical objects, which appears to be something like a physical space. I mean, maybe there are fancy moves you can make saying it's a mixed space, an augmented space, but prima facie in the case of AR, when you see these objects, you see that piano, it seems to be in Washington Square in physical space. When you see the elephant, it seems to be in that space between your hands. So I think the illusion view is even better motivated for AR than for VR. Still, I want to say that typically you perceive virtual objects in AR as virtual. You have the sense of virtuality with augmented reality objects with special, sorry, how did that get there? Oh, I see. There's the elephant. But still, I think it's important that you do retain the sense of virtuality in AR. When you see this virtual objects are, you know, even in this AR world of the future. I mean, right now, AR is sufficiently primitive that most of the experiences you have of augmented reality objects are, you know, not terribly lifelike, even less so than VR because of all the constraints. So no one's going to mistake them for physical objects. So you very strongly get the sense of virtuality. But I think even for probably the sophisticated ARs of the future, like this one, there's very likely to be some residual sense of virtuality. I'll go into the reasons why that's desirable in a moment. But certainly the AR systems we have right now give you the sense of virtuality with special associated affordances again. So you try and reach out with current, at least with current AR systems for a virtual object you see through AR glasses and your hand will go straight through it and so on. So you need special ways to interact with them. What I want to say is that to maintain the non-illusion view of AR, I think the best way to understand this is to say, okay, well, the virtual piano is not physically located in physical space. I mean, that physical space does not physically contain the virtual piano, but it does stand in a somewhat more subtle relationship to physical space. I'm going to say the virtual piano is virtually located in physical space. And I think once we come to use AR, especially these common AR systems a lot, this is going to be the kind of thing we're going to say all the time. Yeah, that virtual piano is there in physical space. Yeah, of course, it's not physically located in the physical space, but it's virtually located in the physical space. You know, and then there's a really interesting question, just what it is for a virtual object to be virtually located at a physical location. Now, this is going to be the very natural sense in which we want to say that the virtual piano is in Washington Square Park. It has, I mean, for example, it has causal powers for AR users there, at least anyone who's using this particular AR system. Then they're going to get experiences of the piano when they're around that location in the park. I mean, there's all kinds of subtleties here. Maybe we're going to have to relativize this to your AR system. Maybe, you know, Meta's version of augmented reality and Apple's and Google's are going to be entirely different. So we're going to say that the virtual piano is virtually located there relative to Meta's system, not relative to Apple's system, and so on. And then maybe all those things are going to have to somehow get coordinated in some way with the contents of perception. But at least to a first approximation, I want to say the virtual piano is virtually located in physical space with augmented reality. And then, I guess, to resist the illusion line, the line I want to take is to say that a sophisticated user perceives the virtual piano as a virtual object that is virtually located in Washington Square. Sophisticated perceivers will not take these virtual objects to be physically located in physical locations. They'll take them to be virtually located in physical locations. And that, I think, is not an illusion, because they really are. I mean, I don't know, this is probably the part of the view which is going to be the biggest stretch for some people, because this may look fairly intellectual, actually perceiving virtual objects as being virtually located. You know, I'd kind of like to make the case that this will be part of the phenomenology of using AR, that we'll at least very often see virtual objects as being virtually located. Certainly there's still plenty one can argue with there, but if you take the view that, you know, that's really the phenomenology of augmented reality, at least some of the time, then this needn't be an illusion either. We're perceiving virtual objects the way they are. Now, this, of course, only works in AR if you correctly perceive virtual objects as virtual with that sense of virtuality, and if you correctly perceive physical objects as physical with that sense of physicality via this kind of cognitive orientation to augmented reality space. It's quite possible not for that to happen. If AR is so good, for example, that virtual objects become entirely indistinguishable from physical objects, and furthermore, there are no cues to distinguish them, and so on, then you may lose that sense of virtuality and the sense of physicality, or maybe they will all have the sense of something broad that subsumes both. If you don't, though, distinguish virtual objects from physical objects in perception, it seems very likely then you'll get potential illusions and certainly corresponding mistakes. Insofar as there's distinct affordances for virtual objects and physical objects, being unable to distinguish them is going to lead to problems in interacting with them. You'll either, you know, occasionally, often interact with virtual objects, taking them to have the affordances of physical objects, which will lead to disaster, and vice versa. Or maybe you'll just end up being so hesitant that you end up just only exploiting common affordances, which won't be useful. So I think it's actually super important to have augmented reality spaces set up so there are at least enough cues that you perceive virtual objects as virtual and physical objects as physical. And then as a bonus, then I think that also helps avoid illusions. This actually leads to, you know, a policy recommendation. And I'm very far from a person normally who thinks about policy and these social issues, but one byproduct of my publishing this book on virtual reality, and at the same time as, you know, the metaverse has blown up to this huge thing, as I've suddenly received a whole bunch of invitations to opine on matters of policy and how virtual worlds should actually be built, including, you know, invitations from some of these corporations like Meta and Roblox to talk to them about these issues, and the World Economic Forum is having a committee on governance in the metaverse. And okay, I'm very much an amateur in any matters of policy, but at least one point where I think the kind of view I have of perception and reality in virtual worlds has a kind of policy outcome, is that has a policy consequence, is the idea of virtual objects should somehow be legible as virtual, and physical objects should somehow be legible as physical. I think it's very important to users of augmented reality that you know which objects are virtual and which objects are physical, so you can interact with them in the right ways. And maybe even going forward to, once there's super high-powered VRs where virtual objects could be indistinguishable from physical objects, they nonetheless should typically be legible as virtual. Physical objects should be legible as physical, and that will help avoid illusions and confusion. By the way, the same issue comes up for AI. People, you're talking to a chatbot online. You really want to know, is it AI? Is it or is it a human being? People sometimes call these bot flags. In interacting with AI systems should be legible as AI. Humans should be legible as humans. Anyway, I think there's a very similar issue with AR. I mean, again, there's a whole issue about whether this is perceptual and post-perceptual. I know a whole lot of people here may think this is actually a post-perceptual effect. I think there's an alternative view nearby for those who think all perceptual contents are relatively low level and you don't get to change your perceptual content by virtue of your knowledge that things are virtual. The alternative view will be that experiencing objects as virtual and virtually located is post-perceptual. I would at least want to say that if you think it's post-perceptual, it's nonetheless important that it's an layer of extremely quick and automatic post-perceptual interpretation that happens, at least for sophisticated users, so automatically that it functions as if it was perceptual, even if you think it doesn't actually have the exact phenomenology of perception. It's not merely a judgment where, oh yeah, I know this is virtual, even though it seems physical. It's that we come to actually automatically interpret things as virtual in using AR. So if you don't think it's perceptual, I'd at least want to make the case that it's a very quick and automatic post-perceptual interpretation tied very closely to the perceptual interpretation. Okay, sum up then. Perception in VR and AR, on my view, need not be hallucinatory or illusory. In both VR and AR, you can correctly perceive virtual objects as they are. Thanks.
Thank you, Dave. I'll stop your screen sharing for you. Thanks very much. If you've got questions or comments, please notify me, Derek, in the queue. Alexandre.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot, David, for the talk. I have a question that is actually a question both for you and for Nathan and Neil, because I'm wondering about your disagreement with virtual fictionalists on the issue of perception in VR. So if I recap, on your view, a virtual entity is, or virtual object is a digital entity, or more accurately, something that is constituted by a digital entity, while for Nathan and Neil, a virtual object is the entity which we make believe to exist when we engage with the digital prop. And as such, it's a fictional entity. What I think is, I have the feeling that there is something of a verbal disagreement here, because you all agree that there are real digital objects. What you disagree about is whether these digital objects or digital entities should be called virtual or not. And at any rate, it seems to me that you could come into agreement on the issue of perception, because both you and fictionalists accept that there are digital objects which are real. So then why can't you both agree that these real digital objects are the causal basis for perception? So in other words, my question is this, do fictionalists have to say that perception in VR or AR is illusory, or hallucinatory? I don't think so. So I was wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree that there, at least very often, are fictional objects associated with VR. It's certainly insofar as virtual reality involves some kind of can be understood as a representation of a physical reality, then there's at least potentially there are physical objects. That elephant represents a physical elephant. There's no physical elephant there. So the physical elephant is at least fictional or merely represented and so on. And that's what I think with most standard VRs, there's at least an interpretation of the situation as physical that involves a fiction. And likewise, Neil and Nathan will allow there's a digital object. I guess I want to say that increasingly, I think for sophisticated users of VR, the fiction becomes kind of increasingly unimportant, and the most salient thing is the virtual objects that really exist that one's interacting with. So it at least becomes extremely natural. So the question is if we both allow there's a digital object and a fictional object, what is the substance of the claim that my claim that the virtual object is the digital object and their claim that it's the fictional object? And that's a subtle question, but I guess part of it is I think that really is genuinely, for me, part of the content of perception that can make our perceptual experiences veridical. And perception actually has an object, and in some cases the object actually has the property that it seems to have, whereas I take it Neil and Nathan will deny that. Now you might say that's actually a verbal dispute because there's going to be two different notions of the object of perception, but that's, I think, much less obvious. Going beyond that, I guess I find just the whole practice of identifying virtual objects with digital objects that really exist just much more true to the experience of virtual reality and virtual worlds. I mean, there really are things that are happening in virtual worlds that are genuinely happening in virtual worlds. To me, to treat all that as some kind of fiction just gets the experience of virtual worlds just wrong. These are real environments that we're inhabiting as they become more and more parts of our lives. Treating them as fictions, I think it's just not going to get the phenomenology right. So maybe from a conceptual engineering standpoint, yeah, if it is a verbal dispute, one way to resolve verbal disputes is to say which way should we use the term for practical purposes. I think it suits our practical purposes in the use of VR much better to treat it all as involving these objects that really exist and events that really happen.
Thanks, Alexander. Lisette.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that talk. And I really enjoyed your book as well, by the way. And I apologize in advance if what I'm about to ask is in there and I'm just forgetting the details. But
page 403.
But so I wanted to ask about the bit at the end where you were kind of giving your policy recommendation about things that we should have augmented objects. It should be kind of known that they're augmented, but it should be easy to distinguish them. So it seems to me there's kind of a puzzle here where, like, on the one hand, if our technology is just not very good, it's going to be really obvious. So you kind of don't need to deliberately mark them out. So you don't necessarily need to do something specific. But in a way, maybe as they get better, there might, in a different sense, be less of a need to do that. So I take it presumably one reason why you'd want to make sure people know that their objects are virtual is so they don't go and reach out and touch them, for instance, because they're not things you can physically touch. But then if you did get like the haptic sort of technology working, then maybe you could reach out and touch them. So is there a sense in which kind of as things get more advanced, there's kind of less of a need to sort of mark them out in that way because there's going to be less of a difference?
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess I'm thinking with current haptic technology, anything like current haptic technology, the experience of interacting with a virtual object via haptic equipment is extremely different from the experience of interacting with a physical object with your physical body. Yeah, so current haptics, maybe it'll give you, there's a distinctive kind of buzz to indicate that you're touching the object and so on, but still the affordances are very different. The experiences you expect to have on reaching out to a physical object are different. And I think that legibility is still important in that context. Otherwise, you're going to be constantly surprised by just how objects respond when they interact with you. Maybe it's a little bit less important than when your hand was simply going to go through the object. But still, I'm thinking it's important. If we had some future level of haptic technology where you could get exactly the same experience by reaching out your hand, and it somehow stimulates your brain in exactly the same way, then maybe for some sufficiently sophisticated future technology, the issue of affordances would then go away, because experientially they would feel, the interactions would feel the same way. Even then, I'm thinking people might well often want to know. It could still just be very important to us to know whether we're dealing with a physical object right now or a virtual object. For example, maybe for the virtual objects, it'll depend on which AR system you're using, what you experience, whereas physical objects will be commonly perceived by everybody, and therefore legibility might be important, but maybe at that point, the reasons for importance might be somewhat different. The ones tied to affordances and action may have decreased in size in significance, as you suggest.
Yeah, great.
Thanks for that. Thanks, Dave. For what it's worth, as a comment, I can totally imagine a scenario where people don't really care whether they can discern whether it's virtual or a physical thing in their perceptual environment, especially for.
I think that also applies, by the way, to AI systems. At least for now, we really want to know whether we're interacting with a human or a chatbot, because they're such totally different things. But maybe in a world of the future where we're centuries in the future, where AI systems are citizens too, and so on, maybe it could actually become a justice issue, that you don't want to have AI systems wearing the star to say, hey, I'm an AI. So yeah, these issues don't necessarily. So although we want that now, it's not totally clear that in 100 or 200 years, the policy recommendations should be the same.
Yeah, that seems right to me. Sorry to insert myself into the queue of the comment. Jack Lyons, please.
Yeah, thanks. And sorry that my camera isn't working. I guess I got black mirrored out of this whole thing. I wanted to just push a little bit further on the Washington Square thing, because I think, like, even if what you say there works, right, that we perceive them as virtually in Washington Square in the AR situation, it looks like we're also going to perceive them as being spatially located with respect to real objects, right? So they're going to be some virtual object is going to, appear in between me and the thing that I'm reaching for, et cetera. They're going to. So I mean, I wonder how. So just how do you handle that? I mean, so how do you get augmented virtual objects to stand in the right kind of spatial relations to physical objects, consistent with what you say about the Washington Square case?
Yeah, that's interesting and tricky, and I certainly haven't thought this through all the way. I guess I'd be, so the virtual elephant seems to be spatially between the two hands. Is it really? I guess what I'd be inclined to go is for an analysis of like virtual betweenness. It's at least virtually between the hands, which turns on some combination of virtual location and spatial location. So we could say, I mean, one way to be for it to be spatially located between the two hands is for it to be virtually located at a physical location, which is between the physical locations of the hands. Like that much is true. It is virtually located at a physical location between the physical locations of the hands. So now we just need to think, okay, how are we going to understand that betweenness relation? Not exactly physical betweenness in the sense that it requires a physical location between the physical locations of the hands, but maybe it's a somewhat more general relation that, say, involves having a virtual or a physical location, which is located between the virtual or physical location of the hands. Maybe we go for like a more generic notion of location that allows both of these to count as sufficient conditions. I mean, the alternative would be to have some very complex relation that involves seeing it as virtually located between the physical locations of those two things. Maybe somehow involving a generic notion of location. Maybe perception will often come to involve a generic notion of location that's neutral on perception and on whether it's virtual location or physical location. And we could use that to analyze betweenness, but I really need to think about the case more.
Okay, I was nodding along in a semi-convinced kind of manner, but you couldn't see that. Thanks.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Jack. Fiona, we're actually just over time, let me say that. So if you do have to leave at the scheduled time of 5, please feel free to. But if you are able to stay on for a couple more minutes, we've got 2 more people in the queue. So we'll let them have a quick chance to ask Dave their question, and then we'll wrap up.
Thanks for a great talk. I enjoyed that so much. So my question is really going to be about trying to understand what you think data structures exactly are. So imagine the following case. Let's suppose you and I are both in the same virtual world, or our avatars are, or however we want to describe that. And we're on some quest and we discover the crock of gold. It seems like there's going to be a data structure on some, distant computer that corresponds to that crock of gold. But it seems like locally on my computer, there's going to be a data structure that corresponds to the crock of gold, and on your computer here. Am I seeing, which of these data structures am I seeing, or do data structures, are data structures multiply realized? Or I don't really understand what a data structure is.
What was the case again? Are we in a massive multiplayer virtual world?
Yeah, and we're on a quest and we discover the crock of gold, and I'm seeing the crock of gold and you're seeing the crock of gold. But it seems like there's 3 data structures. There's the one sitting locally on my computer, the one sitting locally on your computer. There's the one that belongs to the game company that's sending the stuff. So like, I don't understand what data structures are. Is it something that's multiply realized by the computers? Is it?
Yeah, this is tricky. I mean, I guess my first inclination is to say that the one that really matters is the one that's on the server, and that's what you're correspondingly perceiving. Of course, even that one is probably going to be multiply realized for these things where you've got servers with players from around the world. They're going to have all kinds of different data centers with the same data structure realized on multiple computers. And yeah, when you're interacting with it on your local computer. Here's where my knowledge of how this works breaks down a little bit. My guess is some of the time this may involve having a corresponding data structure on your computer, and some of the time just something more like the physical rendering is sent to your computer. But yeah, I do think a lot of the time these data structures will be multiply realized, but I still like to say there's a sense in which there can be a single data structure multiply realized that serves as the causal basis of your experience. That might actually be another reason not to identify it with the hardware.
So, but then I suppose I worry that there could be like, in a way, the sort of case you mentioned, there could be multiple data structures that sometimes one is responsible for the appearance of the crock of gold. Like, when we've got it in the bedroom, it one data structure makes it appear there, but then when we carry it into the living room, then there's a different data structure there, but it's the same. You would want to say it's the same virtual object.
Yeah, in one room you were talking to that cell phone tower out there, which is which was getting its information from one data center, and then you want to walk into the next room, a different window, and you're getting it from a different cell phone tower out there. I guess what I want to say is, although there is a causal path in one case from data center 1 and in another case from data center 2, I want to say there is actually something we can understand as a common data structure, common concrete data structure, which is multiply instantiated simultaneously on all these computers in a robust way. And that when the local instance in data center 1 affects me, or the local center instance in data structure 2 affects me, those can both be understood as a single common data structure affecting me. And exactly how to tell the metaphysics of that is a great question that I don't have fully worked out, but I do think it's just something we want to say so often, all the time, with these data structures that structure our lives. Like some change to the Facebook algorithm just caused massive changes to how businesses are reorganizing their lives. And of course, the Facebook algorithm is multiply instantiated all around the world. But
then it doesn't look like we're tracking, it doesn't look like we're tracking then the things that you say we're tracking, which are ones and zeros in computers. That's not what data structures are.
Yeah, I think that data structures are higher level than ones and zeros. They're constituted by patterns of bits. In this case, they might be constituted by lots of patterns of bits on different machines. But yeah, but they're conditions of existence, what constitutes them, just as it's different from what constitutes a hardware object, say the circuits, as came up with Carty. yeah, I think what constitutes them is something somewhat higher level than what constitutes just a pattern of bits. So I think it's probably best, we probably don't want to say that data structures are identical to patterns of bits any more than they're identical to like structures of atoms. But yeah, the metaphysics, I hope someone out there has worked out the metaphysics of data structures already, but if not, it's a great project that we should all be thinking about.
Thanks.
Thanks, Fiona. Neil, one quick last question from you.
I was just going to ask something very similar to Jack's, but I'll say this about the Fiona case. I think if you take away the intermediate case of the server in between and you make it the two items, the two devices just talking to each other, allow them to be two different architecture devices, right? Apparently I'm not allowed to make Oculus and Vive. Let's make it early Oculus and late Oculus that are not backwards compatible. Then what we're going to end up with is different data structures representing what seems to be, for your case, the same virtual object. So this is we call it the cross-play problem when we throw it your way. But I think that's the souped up version of the problem that presses harder on the same point a bit in the same direction as Fiona.
Can you just, I think I might have missed a couple of details in the case. So what is,
you've got two devices speaking to each other directly, no server.
Yeah.
Right, you've got a single item. In our example, it's a frisbee being thrown from one to the other, and that we're scoring something. We only score once. That'll be important. And then what you've got is the underlying architecture for the devices is incompatible. They aren't the same, right? They've got different architecture. They can speak to each other. One's a PlayStation, the other's an Xbox, Mac, PC, however you like, right? So the data structures in each are going to have to be different because of the different architecture. So now what you've got is, which one's the frisbee? That's the question. You can't say there's two frisbees because we're only scoring it once. We all think there's a common frisbee. We talk like there's a common frisbee and so on. There are two candidates, one in each device, both data structures. Which one's the frisbee?
Are they fundamentally different kinds of data structures? I'm thinking that for this to work, these data structures are at least going to have to be kind of isomorphic in a certain sense. The information they code will
probably be some sort of way isomorphic, but they can be translated modem style as they arrive and depart.
So I guess probably around here, what I'd want to do is to talk about, we always need levels of abstraction and talking about data structures. So move to a level of abstraction where these two distinct data structures can be regarded as instances of a common data type and identify the virtual object with something at the level of the common data type.
But there's two instances, therefore there's two frisbees? No,
one frisbee, because there's one
because it's so abstract.
Type, multiply realized.
Okay.
These common, more abstract data types can be realized by lower data types, and as came up with Fiona, sometimes multiply simultaneously realized. So in this case, multiply simultaneously realized by multiple instances of distinct lower data types.
Yep, and then I'm going to come back with problems about the higher order stuff. Okay, good.
Great, cool cases to think about.
Thanks, Neil. Let's thank our speaker, Dave, again for a lovely talk.